Okay, thanks. Yeah, if you're, as I say, if you're interested in things like history, how traditions shape us, how the way that we hold our bodies or engage in rituals and how this affects us, how culture affects religion, how religion affects politics, it's a great week for that sort of thing. And it is a privilege to be able to run that program. I didn't design it when I'm telling you how good it is. My predecessor's the genius. But I do have the privilege of running it, and it's, if you're interested, I'd love to have you. Okay, so tonight's lecture is on Sufism and the history of Sufism. So let me begin by just telling you sort of where we're going to go and giving you, we're missing a slide there, the overview slide. Is it not there?
Oh, sorry, Brian.
That's okay. Should we just skip it or?
Go back.
Okay.
Let's see where it is.
Sorry, everybody.
The other one, it was the same. If you can, there you go.
Ah, there we go. Okay. So for tonight's talk, I want to start by talking to you about some of the roots of Sufism. So the context in which it emerges and how it sort of evolves over time. It doesn't sort of, poof and it's ready formed. It goes through certain stages. Then we'll describe some of the key practices that shape Sufism and give it its kind of character. Then we'll talk about some of the major structures for Sufism. And this includes the master-disciple relationship, which is really integral to understanding the Sufi path, as well as the role of saints, of lodges or residences for Sufis, and of orders. Orders are sort of like, you might think of them as like Christian monastic orders, where you've got Jesuits and Franciscans. The Sufi path sort of does the same thing. We'll look quickly at some famous Sufis, and then we'll end by talking about the opposition that it has faced, predominantly from traditionalists, and lastly, touch on some modern developments. Okay, and sorry, this is our last little hiccup, but then we should be smooth after that. Okay, so first, how can we define Sufi, the Sufi path? So this isn't the definition, but the definition we'll use tonight is that Sufism is the mystical path of Islam, which seeks union with God. So this is not just seeking to obey God's orders and follow in his path, but really to seek a kind of mystical union that is pursued not alone, but using spiritual guides by following a master or a sheikh that interprets the Quran and really the Islamic tradition allegorically and even esoterically. And if you're not familiar with that word, esoterically means that there is a kind of hidden or veiled meaning when you're reading the Quran or listening to the traditions of Muhammad. And lastly, it privileges experiential knowledge. The Greek word for this is gnosis, over codified knowledge or the knowledge of the jurist or of the scholar. It doesn't disdain those kinds of knowledge, but the best kind of knowledge is that which you experience. Okay, so the mystical path of Islam that seeks union, using guides, interpreting hidden meanings, and does this through experiential knowledge. Okay, the context in which the Sufi tradition emerges is kind of threefold. There is first some leftover sort of Hellenistic influences, even though the Greco-Roman empires are gone by this time. This includes things like Greek philosophy, which continues to shape the whole Mediterranean basin, including allegories like the progression of the soul. In Greek philosophy or Greek thought, you sometimes have this idea of the soul progressing towards the one, the nous, the mind, and later God. Secondly, you have the practice of asceticism. Do you all know what an ascetic is? An ascetic is someone who denies the body in order to break its hold over the mind. And in Hellenistic schools, you had the school of the cynics. And the cynics were people who sort of disavowed the material hold on the self and tried to push aside the physical as not being the meaningful aspect of life. And thirdly, just the idea of gnosis, of there being in a kind of experiential and esoteric knowledge. And so an example of this in the Greco-Roman world would be the mystery cults, for example, where there's a kind of secret knowledge that's available only to some, often to an elect or to an elite. So that's one set of context. Yes?
Just a quick point on the term of gnosis. So in Sufism, the word for Gnostic knowledge is ma'rifa, which means it's more an intuitive understanding of God as opposed to a knowledge that can be passed on. So it's something that you can come to but not through reading or through learning.
Great, thank you. Thanks. Yes, so intuitive instead of book. Thanks. And then the second part of the context I wanted to mention is that of the Christian influences. This includes, again, asceticism, but here it is more prominent. It's not just a school of thought. They litter the landscape. There are Christian monasteries where there are monks that are engaging in practices of fasting, so denying themselves food, of prayer, and other ascetic practices. There is second, their practice of mysticism, of seeking a kind of mystical experience or mystical union in some cases. And thirdly, the practice of communal living. The monks do not simply sit at home and practice this individually. They gather into residences and live communally. And this will have a kind of influence. It's part of the context in which the Sufi tradition will take off. And the third part of the context I wanted to mention is that of empire. The Arabs, soon after Muhammad's death, will pour out of the Arabian Peninsula, and they will quite quickly create literally the largest empire that the world had yet known, extending from the Atlantic shores on the left side of your image all the way deep into India. And so it has gone from merely a sort of spiritual movement to now it is an empire, a multinational empire that has wealth and power, and its leaders now are a dynasty. They live in palaces, they dress in silks, and some people will say, we have lost our way. And in rejection of this, they will not dress in silks, they will dress in wool. And some people believe that the word Sufi, there's some debate over this, comes from meaning a wool wearer, someone who wears coarse wool and not the luxurious silks. Okay, so this is sort of the context in which the Sufi tradition emerges. And it emerges over time. It starts with practices of renunciation, that is, renouncing physical comforts and things of the flesh. This starts early, perhaps within about a half century of Muhammad's death. And the earliest example of this that I know of is Hassan al-Basri. He actually knew some of Muhammad's companions. He's born around the time of Muhammad's death, so he would have known some of Muhammad's younger companions, and he practiced a sort of ascetic lifestyle. This lifestyle includes deprivation, depriving yourself of certain comforts, like food, like a regular sleep, and like material comforts. And as you push these material comforts in, you bring something else in. And what else do you bring in place? You bring in excess spiritual practices, supererogatory actions. It's a fancy word that means sort of above and beyond. So in Islam, you're supposed to pray 5 times a day. They will end up sometimes praying more, or doing the prayers longer, or praying in the middle of the night, as we'll see, or praying all night. You're supposed to fast at Ramadan. We will fast besides Ramadan. Okay, so a kind of extra spiritual practice. But in addition, it should be mentioned that while they have picked some things up from the Christian milieu, there are some things that the Christian monastics are doing that they will deliberately not pick up. And this includes celibacy. Now later I will mention that there were some Sufis who did practice celibacy, but the difference is, in Christianity, for ascetics, for monks and nuns, celibacy is the rule. Everyone is celibate. In the Sufi path, it will be the exception, the rare exception to the rule. The rule will be they do not practice celibacy, you will have a family. And the other thing they will not pick up is that the Christian monks withdrew from society. Christian monasticism takes off in a bit of the 3rd and particularly the 4th century. And where does it take off? In the deserts. People would go into the deserts in Egypt to withdraw from society, to be alone with God, and to struggle with the temptations of the devil and of the flesh. And later the deserts of Syria. But the Sufis will not do that. They will not withdraw from society. They have families, they will live in cities, and it will take place in more settled environments. So that's the first stage, this renunciation, rejection of the physical, and replacing it with more spiritual practices. The second thing that adds to this, the second leg of it, if you will, is the adoption of esoteric ideas, the idea of things being hidden. This emerges perhaps within another half century, and the key figure here is a guy named Jafar al-Sadiq. He writes a Quranic commentary, and al-Sadiq has great prestige. He is what is called an alid. And an alid is a descendant, a blood descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, through, in particular, his son-in-law Ali and his daughter Fatima. Ali is where you get the word alid. Some of you may know that there are Shias and Sunnis in Islam, and this will become the basis of, he will become a particularly key figure in the Shia tradition. But at this early stage, the hardness of that separation is not yet there, and he has status and credibility really in the entire Muslim world. Sunni commentaries still look to him, so he was a person of great status, and he writes this commentary that suggests that the true meaning of the Quran is not just what you see and is obvious. Instead, he will say that there are multiple layers of interpretation, and that you will see them according to the level of the listener. Okay, and so if you don't see it, it's not that it's not there, it has to do with what you are sort of ready to see. And so this gives a certain validity to kind of the esoteric path. Okay, and so this is, these are sort of the two things we've got. We've got the renunciation, and now the idea that there's a veiled and hidden meaning to the Quran, and later to other traditions within Islam. The emerging of the Sufi tradition will take place in certain stages. It starts as kind of private practices, a student and a teacher, and they might meet in the master's home, but later it will become more formalized and organized by the 11th century. One of the key figures here is a great theologian named Al-Ghazali, and Al-Ghazali has credibility. He was a jurist, a theologian. He is like Augustine for Christians or Nagarjuna for Buddhists. He's a guy of great credibility, and he has a kind of mystical experience, and he welds the Sufi path to the more orthodox tradition, and he's a guy who can lend his credibility and status to it. And around the same time, you get the emergence of lodges. That is residences where Sufis will gather together in Iran and Syria and Egypt. And in religion, physical space matters. You know, if you can have a physical presence, people see it all the time, it's part of the landscape, and it will help the Sufi path to, it's always there sort of beckoning for people who, you know, to potentially be lured in and to say, look, this looks attractive to me, and the tradition gains more sort of stability or strength. And it will lead by the next century to Sufi orders, paths or lineages that I'll talk more about, but these are like different schools of Sufi practice. This really helps to expand the tradition. And the last sort of peg of this is they receive patronage. Political leaders now see that this path is not just some people off in somebody's house in some quiet room. It's part of the landscape. It's a growing part of the landscape. And I, the ruler, will get credibility because I will lend money to this lodge and to this order. I will become its patron. And by giving it money, I will gain some of its status as a good, upstanding Muslim. And so now you have money and buildings, and the tradition grows. And where it started out very small, by the bottom, it is becoming an expanding, incredible, significant part of the Muslim landscape. Okay, so that's sort of the evolution. So, what is it that defines the Sufi path? And what we're going to look at primarily is I want to look at several practices. There are many practices, so I've tried to pick out some of the key ones. This includes prayer, Dhikr or Zikr, which we will talk about, the use of poetry, the use of music, the use of dance, the use of numerology or letterology, that is the attribution of important meaning to numbers and to letters within texts like the Quran, and lastly, the veneration of saints and the veneration of their shrines, as we will see. So we'll talk about these in turn. Let us start with prayer. Now, as you know, in Islam, prayer is required. There are 5 daily prayers that are required. But what you're going to see here is that a regular practice is taken and then enhanced. And so the first thing that is done is that just those regular prayers themselves are enhanced. Sometimes people will recite extra verses from the Quran or extra hadiths. A hadith is a tradition of something that Muhammad said or did. So either you're quoting the Quran or maybe you're quoting Muhammad through these hadiths. Okay, so you enhance the regular prayers. The second thing that's done often is the adding of an additional prayer or the shifting of a prayer, the last prayer of the day, to the late night. And so the way this would work is that after midnight you would have already gone to sleep and you would wake up again after midnight and you would engage in this extra prayer. And this extra prayer would have 12 cycles. Usually in a prayer you have 2 or 4 cycles, but this is a very different prayer. You're going to do 12 cycles. by far the longest, far longer than the regular prayers. And you know, it's after midnight, you've gotten up, you still have that essence of sleep on you. The city, the world is quiet and dark, and now you're going to engage in the longest, deepest prayer of the day. You can see how all of this is to foster an intense sort of experience, a different experience than the other 4 prayers. And again, there would be sometimes lengthy recitations from Quran as well. Okay, and in addition, there might be other prayers that are assigned to you that you would use on specific days or in specific circumstances. Okay, so you've taken a regular thing, the Muslim prayers, but you've enhanced it. Okay, so that's the first practice. The second one is the use of recitation, Dhikr or zikr, which is a word that means essentially mentioning or recitation. This would be often reciting the name of God or short phrases. And so people might simply recite the name of God, Allah, 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 Allah. But we might do it all together, maybe in a small room like this. And there can be body movements that go with it as well. Allah, Allah. And it would get louder and louder and faster and louder. And if you have a room of people doing that, it creates a surge of emotion. And then a few moments later, you'll be whispering it. Allah, Allah. And the emotions go up and down. It's the same sort of pattern if you go to an evangelical church and they play music ahead of time. It gets loud and exciting, and there's anthems, and then there's the quiet ballad of love for Jesus. And it's the same thing if you go to a concert by, Coldplay or whoever. Right? We do this because it works, humans, to go through the intense emotion and then the quiet. And so that's kind of how that can work. Other times it's phrases like La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, or Hu, which is another way of saying God. At other times you can recite the 99 names of Allah, and in the image you will see that there's a man's hand there holding beads, and those beads can be used to recite the 99 names of God. These names are God's attributes, the loving, the just, Al-Rahman, Al-Rahim, the merciful, the benevolent. So you can go through those beads and recite the 99 names. The goal of this, essentially, is of much of the Sufi path is fana, or I don't even know if I'm saying that right, fana, it's the annihilation of the self, to push out all of your own thoughts, your needs, your worries, your to-do list, your accomplishments, to eradicate all of that, and what is left, just the concentration on Allah, on God. And this is driven from a passage in the Quran where it sort of says, remember me, and I will remember you. And I found this very interesting, which is that it is believed that in the early centuries that this practice actually was silent, that it was probably done just quietly in one's head. But within a few centuries, it became vocal. And it is believed by some scholars that the vocalization of the zikr really helped to spread Islam. You would see these people doing it, you would hear them, and there's the obvious visual or the encounter of their piety, of their commitment, and that draws you in. And so this may have been an important thing in spreading Islam. Okay, so that is zikr. Third is the use of poetry. I should mention something here. Poetry was very important in the Arabian Peninsula even before Muhammad's time. There were Arab poets who would go around and chant of the accomplishments of their tribe, of the greatness of their tribe, that would compose poems when they're going into battle, because if you could create poetry around your victory, it would help to make it happen. In many ancient cultures, they did not think of words the way most of you think of words. For most of us, words just convey intention. If you say it incorrectly, I can fix it and say it again. But for many cultures historically, words had a kind of power. We have vestiges of this in our society. Usually, if you say something and you didn't quite get it right, you can kind of fix it. But if you're in a certain setting and you say the words I do, something happens, right? It has power. Or if a judge sits up there and says guilty and makes a sound and knocks his gavel, he can't come back an hour later and say, yeah, I don't think so. I've changed my mind. No, something happened. We have vestiges of this. But in many ancient cultures, this was much more pronounced. And so words had power, and poetry poetry was, the power of words kind of on Jolt Cola. And in the Arabian Peninsula, this mattered. And so the Quran then was power. Okay, so what you have is that Arabic poetry emerged from bards who were praising the tribe. And they were considered to be inspired sometimes by spirits called jinn. This is where we have the word a genie, actually. In the Islamic, this precedes Muhammad, but in the Islamic world, the jinn enter it as well. You have God, you have angels, you have jinn, and you have humans. And so that was kind of the understanding. And so when the Quran comes along, it too uses poetry, but it is not preaching victory in war. It is preaching submission to God, and it is not inspired by jinn. It is not even inspired by God. It's not inspired by God. It is the speech of God. God's not inspiring somebody. It is the speech of God. So poetry is, I'm doing all this to emphasize to you that poetry in Islam has a presence. It is the way, the primary way, the closest way that you touch God. In Christianity, the closest way one touches God is through Jesus. In Judaism, perhaps through the law, the covenant. But in Islam, it's not through Muhammad as much as Muhammad is revered. The closest you come to Allah is you can hear him speak in the Quran, sometimes in beautiful poetry. And not all of it's poetry, but some of it is. Okay, so this is the setting, this power of poetry. And Arabic and Persian happen to facilitate this, both of them, very well. Because the language, as I understand, rhymes very easily. You can use the same rhyming sound and create long sequences of rhymes, which in English is not so easily done. And in addition, this poetry is so important that even the visual of the language matters. In the background, you can see the Arabic writing. This is a very subjective statement on my part, but I don't know if there's a written language that has the visual beauty of Arabic. It is so beautiful. And some early manuscripts of the Quran actually have very few words on a page drawn very large so that you can look at it, so you can look at the beauty. And so sometimes the prayers were recited, but sometimes what the Sufis would do was just look at the visual of the phrase or of the prayer. So you're taking it in both orally, A-U-R-A-L, but also with your eyes, the visual of it. And this poetry was replete with imagery, all sorts of imagery. The imagery of wine, of intoxication. And this is interesting because in Islam it is forbidden, of course, to drink alcohol, but the imagery is that of being drunk. Not on alcohol, of course, not on your favorite red wine or whatever it might be, but drunk with love for God. The other imagery was that of the erotic, which included sometimes even poetry that was homoerotic. It was a love for a young girl, a young boy, but of course the ultimate, this is symbolic, that the infatuation is with God. Also the imagery of Persian gardens and ascent imagery, ascending to heaven. Ascent imagery is very common in many mystical paths. And what it will draw on here in particular is there is a famous episode in Muhammad's life where he takes a night journey. He travels to Jerusalem and he undergoes some actions there in Jerusalem, and then he ascends. After he meets some key prophets, he ascends through the levels of heaven and eventually gets into the top level in the very presence of God. And so this provides a metaphor for Sufis. And there will be Sufi saints who are said to take the same journey. Not physically. Muhammad's understood to have done it physically. They will say, we have traversed this journey sometimes, but just spiritually. So that's some of the imagery that you've got. And at times, this poetry could be syncretic. And I don't know if you know what syncretism is. It's a fancy word. All it really means is blending or mixing. Sometimes the Sufi path will allow people to transcend the boundaries of just our path and to see God in lots of paths. Particularly in India, sometimes some of the poetry will incorporate the names of Hindu gods or of tantric imagery. Okay, so that is poetry. So now we've got prayer, now we've got Dhikr, the recitation, you remember that, and now we have the use of poetry. Next is the use of music. Music was not universal. Many people associate music now with the Sufi path. It was quite common, but not all the orders used music. And it's very different than you see it today in the traditional literature. What it really emphasized was not the playing of the music, but the listening to it. The literature actually refers to it as sama, which is the word for some kind of hearing or listening, is sort of the translation of that word. The emphasis here was not on the beauty of the playing, it was on ethical listening, ethical, cultivated listening. And it was, you remember I was just telling you that there was an understanding here that words had power, and that poetry was the power of the oral word, but on Joe Cole or whatever I said, well, imagine now that you have added music, right? Now you have very powerful words, almost something to be treated with care. And so it was carefully guarded because of the power of the oral. And what do I mean by carefully guarded? It was not to be done in public. Now today it is, but traditionally it was not done in public. And not too often. You shouldn't listen to it all the time. It was once in a while, and only for ethical listeners, for people who could very carefully focus on the creator that the music and the poetry is pointing to, and not the created, not get lost in the beauty of the music itself. You might even prepare yourself for this. You might engage in prayer beforehand, and you might engage in the practice of ablutions, which is called wudu. Before Muslims pray, some of you will know this, there's a ritual washing of the hands and of the face and of the feet. It takes 45 seconds or something like that. You would do this before prayer, and some of these people would do it before the playing of the music to cultivate a certain attitude that this, you have to be ready to listen appropriately, to look for God and not be lost in the music itself. Okay? So that's the music. Notice here so far the emphasis on language, right? The language of prayer, the language of recitation, the language of poetry and its power, and now music. We have this, this is something about Islam, is that a lot of the aesthetic, a lot of the beauty in Islam has to do with the oral, A-U-R-A-L, the heard, and even the visual of language. When you go into a mosque, a lot of the decor is the calligraphy. A lot of it is around the word, the poem, the rhyme. If you go into a Hindu temple, they also have an emphasis on sounds like Om, the chant, but a lot of the aesthetic is visual. When you go into a Hindu temple, it's a cornucopia of 1,000 colors, and there's beautiful murtis or images. But in Islam, there's an emphasis, I think, in some ways on the language, the oral, the word. Okay. Dance. Now we're on to something else that's not about the word, but dance. The previous one for music, I told you that it was not universal, but it was quite common, but not universal, that the particular Sufi branch would use music. For dance, it's not only not universal, it was traditionally uncommon. Today, this is the visual for Sufi. If you go into Google and type in Sufi and images, up come 1,000 people doing this dance, the whirling dervish dance. But traditionally, dancing was uncommon. Spontaneous dance could occur during the use of music. Someone might just get up and sort of move their body in the moment, but others would not. Others might sit completely still, even through a moment of ecstasy, to experience an inner ecstasy and hold the body completely unmoving. But dance could happen. The dance that, the only order that kind of did the dance regularly is the Mevlevi order that descends from the poet Rumi, who I'll talk about a little bit later. And the dance that you now see, the whirling dervish dance, took form kind of in the 17th century. So it's a little bit more recent. And it was not that common. Even as late as the 19th century, this one scholar quotes that of 300 Sufi lodges that were in Istanbul at the time, there were only 4 that were doing this dance. So how did it become so large? This is another example of the clashing of cultures and how ideas shift in the clashing of cultures. Because one of the things that happened is one of these lodges was near where a lot of Westerners resided, colonial advisors, merchants, people of this nature, and they were entranced by the dance. And what they did was they wrote about it, they drew it, it became a kind of art thing that was passed around in Western circles, and eventually this created a kind of feedback that has influenced the overall image of Sufism. In the clash with the West and the rest of the world in these colonial encounters, you often find both sides that get changed. The power sometimes can be quite unequal, but this is one of those times where a fascination affected the tradition itself. Because you do see this dance, I just want to talk about it briefly and some of the symbolism of the imagery. Have most of you seen these images, by the way? Most of you have, okay. The conical hat is supposed to represent a kind of tombstone of the ego, because I mentioned it's the annihilation of the self, the death of the ego. And usually when the dance begins, you will see the dancers begin with their arms crossed. Later you see them out, but they begin crossed so that they look like the number 1, to symbolize the oneness of Allah. And then when the dance starts, it is begun, they come with black cloaks on top, and either I've seen them begin with the black cloaks and then remove them, or sometimes it's removed at the start and reveals the white underneath. And the black is the death, again the death of the self, and the white is new life, resurrection. And when you spin with the right hand up to God, the left hand down, and you circle to the left, so that when you circle, what you are circumambulating is your own heart. In Islam, you might know about the pilgrimage to Mecca, and you circumambulate the Kaaba. And so here, what do you circumambulate? The heart itself. So it's rich. It's a very symbolically rich dance. Okay, so that's the dance. Next, I want to talk about numerology and letter magic. I really struggled with that word magic. I don't like it. We often use that word to say a spiritual practice that we look down upon, but I couldn't convey. At the same time, it conveys something in our culture. I didn't know quite how to convey what I was getting at. But there's attention to numbers and letters as having hidden power and hidden meanings, for lack of a better term. This has to do with attributing numbers to Arabic letters. This was also a practice that some Jews engaged in, attributing numbers, numerical values to letters. Sorry, did someone say something?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yes, okay. And therefore reading hidden meanings and clues. The numbers tell some sort of pattern or story. So you just see a word, whatever the word is, but no, those letters have numerical values, and those numerical values are telling you a hidden thing that many people would otherwise not see. And this may be rooted in and I'm probably going to say this poorly, but the mukata'at. What this is at the start of about a third or a quarter of the surahs of the Quran, there are mysterious letters, sometimes 2 letters or 3 or 5, never more than 5, and no one knows why they're there. All throughout Islamic history, people have speculated, what do these letters mean? Maybe it symbolizes something, and so it leads to this idea that there's some sort of deeper meaning, some hidden meaning in the letters, and so it's sort of rooted in that practice. And the last major practice I want to talk to you about is the veneration of Sufi sheikhs who become seen as kind of saints, especially upon their passing. So these are basically revered Sufi masters, and when they die, often tombs, elaborate tombs, and that's what is depicted here, are built around their grave. And these become places of pilgrimage and of power. There is baraka there is blessing, there is power that you can go and you can be healed, and your mother can get better and things of this nature. So you go there to access that kind of power. We all know life can be difficult. We need access to these sorts of things. Sometimes people, quite often it can be approached a bit like a patron. A sort of deal could be made. If you, the saint who is gone, but their spirit is there, if you will heal my son, I will do something for you. I will donate money to the shrine. I will pay for the recitation of the Quran at the shrine. And so there's a kind of bargaining that goes on, and people do this in many forms of life. And sometimes the saints had specialized blessing. That is, the particular saint would be known that this is a good place to go if you're struggling to have a baby. This is a good place to go if you have this kind of illness. And so certain sites could have certain special attributes attached to them. And these shrines were very important in spreading Islam and Sufism. Again, visual space matters. When you want to spread a religion, building big buildings matters. They last for centuries. People see them. You can go there and be healed. And maybe you're not even Muslim. Maybe you're a Sikh, or we say Sikh. Maybe you're a Hindu, but you haven't been able to have a baby. And you know, I know some other people have gone there and got pregnant. I'm going to go. You see, and it becomes a place that can start to pull some people into the Sufi path and into Islam itself. There would also, sometimes you could come away with little things you could hold, amulets or talismans that had power. This could also be when the sheikh was still alive, the saint was still alive. I read one account of people, the sheikh would write out a prayer using the Arabic calligraphy, and when he was done, they would wash the paper and they would collect the inky water, and people actually drank it, that it would be healing for you to drink the water that the prayer was written with by the sheikh. Okay, so amulets and talismans. And the major thing that goes on at these shrines, besides the regular pilgrimage, is the marriage festival. But the marriage festival is not the anniversary of their marriage, it's the anniversary of their death. Why? Because at their death, they did not simply cease to be, they finally achieved the union that they were seeking, the union with God, right? We talk about marriage as being a union, it's the union with God. And so there are these large festivals that celebrate their death day. Those are some of the major practices. There are other practices that include fasting. Fasting is often broken by eating dates. 40-day meditations is another thing that you hear talked about. Bodily mortification, and I'll talk more about that in a while. This is the intentional piercing of the flesh in one way or another. And lastly, sometimes the wearing, I mentioned to you that originally they wore wool garments, and sometimes there would still be some who would go around in very poor sort of patchy garments. Okay, so those are sort of some of the major practices. I've been talking for a bit. Does anyone have any questions or comments, or anyone want to? Yes?
There's also a practice that I heard of called muraqabah, which is reflecting or observing.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. There's also a practice I heard of called muraqabah, which is a state of observance where you reflect on divine names and attributes. It's not really a remembrance, it's sort of a meditation.
Yes.
Observed in some Sufi orders, especially in the Naqshbandi order.
Yes, thanks. Thank you. And a couple up here up front.
Yeah, could you kind of describe sort of the point of origin of Sufism, if it's known, and its geographic spread, even up till now?
Yeah. So geographically, it's believed to have started basically in Persia and perhaps Egypt. So today we'd say Iran and Iraq and Egypt, and spread from there. It comes to Turkey a little later. It goes to India again a little later. There's no person you can trace it to. I mentioned some of the early figures like Hassan al-Basri is famous for sort of the renunciation, and then Jafar al-Sadiq is sort of a key moment of creating an esoteric commentary and giving it the credibility that he gave. So those are some of the early figures. So even within a half century to a century after Muhammad, you have the first emblems of the fire, I guess you would say.
Sorry, how about the people of the bench who were actually existed in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, that they were also called Sufis?
Can I
Sorry.
remind you, because we're live streaming this event,
Oh.
if we can, speak to the microphone, otherwise people can't hear you
Sure.
on Facebook.
How about the people of the bench that existed in the time of the Prophet Muhammad that later on were called Sufis?
I don't know what to say about that. There's, from what I've read, there's different sort of arguments about exactly where it should start and how far back you should go. You could go as far back as that. As I say, some people have pointed to some of these later figures, but there is at some points, I think, sometimes a lack of the documentation people would want to sort of absolutely say. But and you will find actually with almost all religions that the drive is always to put things right to the origin. Right, no matter what it is, if it's Judaism, if it's Christianity. Martin Luther is not going to say, I'm inventing something new when he starts Protestantism. No, I'm just doing what was there originally. And when Jews create the oral Torah, if some of you know what that is, they don't say we're inventing something new. They're saying it's back with Moses. It's just been passed down orally to us. So there is always a drive for earlier, and possibly it does. But I think there's some counter voices that might argue that. Yes?
Yeah, I was thinking about Quakerism, which is the sort of the Christian semi-equivalent. It's the mystical, the mysticism edge of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're talking about experiential knowledge, I thought of Mary Dyer. She was an American Quaker who was hanged for blasphemy, I think. She was an evangelist, which Quakers don't do anymore, but they did in those days. And she was thrown out of Massachusetts, and she went back, and they said, they threw out again, so if you come back, we'll execute you. And she did, and they did. And in her trial, she was asked if she believed in the virgin birth, and she said, "That is not a truth that has been revealed to me."
Yeah, the Quakers are an example of that intuitive knowing as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the structures or institutions of the Sufi tradition. And in particular, perhaps the most fundamental is that of the master-disciple relationship. And to understand the Sufi path, you have to understand something about how this relationship has existed predominantly over time. It really, for most of its history, not perhaps in the first couple of centuries, but fairly quickly, gets to a level of demanding sort of total devotion and subservience to the master. An unconditional obedience. The disciple would take care of the master, take care of physical needs, look after family needs if necessary, sort of total absorption. The disciple may need the master's blessing in order to make their own life decisions around travel or around things like getting married. And the sheikh's words were sometimes understood to be God's words, that the sheikh has annihilated the master has done this, and so when they speak at some level, sometimes it's really not them speaking, it's God. And so what this meant is that in some of the literature, even the most fundamental Islamic duty, which is to submit to none other than Allah, becomes reinterpreted as to submit to the sheikh, because out of them God is actually speaking. And you can imagine how this will generate some opposition in some circles to the Sufi tradition, which we'll talk about later. But this is some of the sort of the setup for this. I should add that this relationship, though, is not just one of obedience, it is an emotional relationship. There is to be a kind of love relationship for the disciple to the master, for example. It is described in very tender terms, familial terms and metaphors. And so much so, the disciple is sometimes called the murid, which means the desirer, the one who desires, and the master is called the murad, the desired, the sought after. And so it's obedience, but it's an obedience that's born of love, an idealization of the master, a seeking out of the master. Almost at times, some of the language has a language of infatuation about it, almost, one might say. And the master then, of course, provides leadership. They provide teachings and instruction, but also guidance for things like what kind of extra practices and disciplines that the disciple should undergo. To give you one example of this, this is just one example. This is from the 14th century. It's an initiation ritual for a student who's now joining a master. Not every initiation ritual would look like this. It's just one that gives some sense of what this relationship might look like. And so in this initiation, the disciple arrives, and he's bearing gifts. Often a cloak for the master, and then other things, flowers, sweets, fruits, things like this. And if they don't have money for the cloak, then they would just bring those other gifts. Some for the master, and some for the master's existing disciples. When the disciple enters the room, he would bow, he would kiss the attendant's feet. When he's brought into the room of the master, he would bow again and kiss the floor of the room. When the master comes, he would kiss the master's feet. So there is this humbling, this subservience to the master. And all of this is done not, not legalistically, not mechanically, but with much emotion. It describes that there's a lot of crying and emotion. The person is overcome with their attachment to the master. And at times, they may be required to perform ablutions. I read of one account of someone who, this written account, where the person never saw their master without first fasting and without doing the wudu, the ablution that I was mentioning to you earlier. And so this can be also done at the initiation. They might go through this kind of ritual washing. And then it described him coming in and sitting facing the master while the master was facing Mecca. And you see symbolically what that is, right? It is that the master is the path to Mecca. The master is acting as a mediator, as you will, between the disciple and God, someone who helps them sort of get there. And there is this back and forth where the master says, I'm not worthy, and the disciple says, no, you are my master. And this goes back and forth several times, with the master sort of disavowing this and the disciple sort of insisting upon it. And eventually it ends when the master cut a little bit of the person's hair and puts a hat on them, the hat of the order. And it said in more modern times, if this was a woman, sometimes these rituals can sometimes look similar, but physical touch would be avoided. They wouldn't cut their hair. They would hold on to a piece of their hijab, the headscarf, or something like that. So not all initiations would go like this, but this is one sample of initiation from medieval times, and you get the sense of a little bit of how that sort of relationship goes. Okay, the master, eventually, some of them achieve a very high level. This is a current Lebanese Sufi sheikh, as I mentioned, in Lebanon. These saints can be quite idealized. They were sometimes described as being sinless, and they can command powers. In the literature, it describes them healing people, being able to read minds, flying, by location, being at two places at once, walking on water, commanding elements, being able to order nature and animals around, reviving the dead, all sorts of things. Not every Sufi sheikh by any means, but some of them are said that in the literature throughout time to have these sorts of powers. As I mentioned, when they die, sometimes shrines are created, and some, I found this particularly interesting, historically, some were given their own hadiths. A hadith, as I mentioned to you, is a saying or deed of Muhammad, and it's a kind of oral tradition. It starts about a century or so after Muhammad dies. There are lots of these hadiths, thousands and thousands of them, and some folks will go around and collect them and try to sort out which are real and false, because everyone agrees it can't all be real. There's too many of them, and some of them are in conflict. This hadith says Muhammad says A, this one says Muhammad says A is horrible. So one of these cannot be right? And so what they would do is they looked at what's called the isnad, the chain of transmission. How do we know Muhammad said this? Well, Erjan tells me he said it. And how does Erjan know? Well, he heard it from you, who heard it from that person, who heard it from that person, who heard it from this person who is Umar, a companion of Muhammad, who heard it from Muhammad. And for this hadith, every time I find someone who has that idea that Muhammad said X, I would trace back the chain. And the more roots there were back to Muhammad, and the more that the names in that line looked credible, the more valid the hadith was. And so there's this school of sort of which ones are valid and not valid. What you have here is that some of the Sufi sheikhs, this is a practice only done for Muhammad, to see what's valid about these sayings that Muhammad said or did. Some of these Sufi sheikhs, there would be hadiths created about them. That this person heard from this person that the sheikh said this. Right? And I don't know if I can convey to you, this is saying something from a status perspective, to create the same sort of isnad that you use for the Prophet Muhammad. Because Muhammad is, the biggest guy on the block. Yes, can we get a microphone over there?
The use of hadith is something that was also prevalent in Shiite circles. So especially in 12er Shiism, once the last Imam went into occultation, then the group had to turn to the use of hadith. And so that sort of started before the Sufi saints picked up that tradition.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Sorry. And in the Shia tradition, these hadiths sometimes don't go to Muhammad. You have hadiths of Ali and all the different imams. That's right. Yes, that's right. And so now you have it with the sheikhs as well. And then the other thing that happened, and this surprised me even more, is some of these saints gave hadiths directly from Muhammad. That is, the sheikh would say, Muhammad said this, and the chain of transmission was the sheikh, who might live in the 12th century, and then Muhammad. And how does that work? Because he had encountered it in a kind of manifestation, a vision, some sort of connection to Muhammad through dreams, some kind of mystical connection to Muhammad. So that, my friends, is bold. Was there a question up there? Can someone run a mic? It's just online, they can't hear it. It's a problem.
I just wanted to know how is the master-disciple dynamic? Is that across all Sufi orders, or is it particular to some? And also, this idea of kind of having the sheikh mediate versus more direct ascension through the heart. Like, is there kind of a, depending on the order, is there emphasis on one more than other, or how does that kind of relate?
Yeah, so from my understanding, the master, the sheikh and the disciple relationship is common across all the orders, but the manifestation of how that shakes out can vary. And I also think in modern times that there's been a lot of changes to this. So this might not be how it's always done today. Sorry, you want to say something? Sorry, a microphone.
Maybe in more recent history, the Sufi orders are predominantly ones that have the disciple saint connection, but historically there are orders that did not have saints, and there are several saints who themselves did not have a sheikh and would sort of attribute their learning to either directly a connection with Muhammad or through another character or personage in the Quran known as Al-Khidr, who is a wise personage who is sort of almost immortal.
Okay, sorry, thanks for that correction. Over here.
Hi. Just wondering if Sufism is based on experiential knowledge rather than like learning down through culture and generations, then why is there even a structure of disciples and like just their teachers, and then also like taking the words of sheikhs and stuff, if it's supposed to be like innately going through experiences and coming to things on your own. So I'm just wondering like how can the whole thing be based off of that yet have this structure created around such aspects?
Yeah, I think I think for our society, we grow up in a very individualistic society, and so as soon as something is mediated for us, that almost interferes with sort of the direct experience, I think, for how many of us think. But I guess for a lot of these orders, the understanding was the master could, help guide you through the right practices that would help you to have that experience. But there are criticisms even from without about the role of the sheikh and the mediation. So the criticism, the qualms that you have been shared by others as well. But for some, it was a path that was valid. Yeah.
Yes, I have just a little comment about Sufism generally. From where they did get this kind of authentic evidence of what they are doing? How come they created the sheikh can say something like hadith and he as if he is like the Prophet, peace be upon him? Is not right. And the resources for the Muslim, the Quran and the Sunnah, what the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, and what happened after the Prophet, peace be upon him, for the companions and the people who followed the Prophet, peace be upon him. But not right for any Sufi, whatever he is or wherever he is, to create his own from his own way of thinking, and the people just follow. It's not right. Otherwise, we will have 1 million opinion about anything in Islam, and there will not be Islam anymore.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So what you're saying is some of the criticisms that have been leveled within the Sufi tradition. There are, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. There is an argument that no, this goes back to the Prophet, that the Prophet himself engaged in practices like meditation, like on the night of power when he receives the first revelation of Quran, that he himself is a frugal man, that he engaged in fasting. So some will point to and say, no, we're continuing in the path of Muhammad. And the night journey was another sort of thing that's sometimes highlighted. But others have leveled some of the criticisms that you have as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking that this is sounding like sort of what happened with the split in Christianity when Protestantism arose, which was created as a means of having an unmediated experience of God, where you didn't have the mediation of the Roman Catholic Church and its hierarchy to, decipher for you and interpret for you and direct, as to how you're supposed to interact with God. Protestants, in theory, could pray to God directly and interpret the Bible directly. And so you get kind of a smart-ass quip that, said by somebody who obviously was a critic of this, that, for instance, in England, Protestant England starts with France, which is Roman Catholic. France is a land of one religion and 1,000 sauces. Sauces for your food.
Okay.
Whereas England is a land of 1,000 religions and only one sauce. Was it Voltaire? Yeah. And so, that's obviously a criticism because, who wants 1,000 religions? They're obviously going to, contend with one another.
Right.
So I'm wondering, whether this is kind of almost like a kind of a natural reaction to having possibly, a strong mediating structure, and then there's a rebellion, but then you have the problem of then the way the rebellion takes shape is that it becomes splintered.
Yeah, that's right. And this is one of the things about, with mediation often comes some control at times over interpretations, right? And in Islam, there has been, as in every religion, you'll get kind of the spectrum of this. So some of the Sunni branch would say, you can't have any mediators between you and Allah. In the Shia tradition, there have been mediators. There have been the imams who have played that role. And the sheikhs, in some ways at times, some of the saints look a bit like the imams. They have hadiths attributed to them, as you can have hadiths in Shia tradition attributed to the imams. So sometimes you get this mediation, and sometimes not so much. Okay, is it okay if we keep going? All right, so where was I? Oh yes, the hadiths. So there was, in some of the early centuries, there was this question of how great are these people? Are they at the level of the prophets? And the language was always, no, they're below the prophets. But you can see how some of these things start to raise the question. And they would always say, no, there's the prophets, and then the Sufi saints, the friends of God. So a level below. We just talked about this, kind of being intermediaries to God. And in the key orders, they would always trace their founder's lineage back to Muhammad. I think in every order but one, it goes through Ali. So these people were both people of great reverence and status and spiritual achievement, but they also had the lineage. And again, you can see at times there's certain Shia ideas that, for those of you who are familiar with that, that have parallels or similarities. And another question way in the back corner.
Brian, do you think we're going to be able to finish all the slides by 9?
Oh, wow. Yes.
Questions?
Yeah, okay. So last question. And then
Just a quick note that I heard there is a controversy between the hierarchy of these intermediaries, because the friend of God and the prophet of God, which one comes first? Just to note that there might be some controversial opinions about that.
Yeah, there is controversy. And actually, I'll talk a bit more about the opposition in a moment, though you guys have voiced some of it. Okay, so we have these saints. The other thing we have are the lodges and orders, and the graphic shows you some of the famous sort of orders. The lodges sometimes are then given patronage, which over time sometimes allows the formation of these sort of orders. And they became vital to spreading Islam and the Sufi path. They were often located on trade routes. And so merchants would come and they could have lodgings there, and they could pick up on these ideas and sometimes be won over to them, and then as they travel, they would carry them with them. Some of these lodges operated as almshouses, but eventually some of them would become kind of fundamental institutions in the region, and even come in some cases to play a kind of governing role. The orders were defined usually by two things: their methods that they used and the lineage, that is, they traced back to a particular sheikh. And as I mentioned to you, all of them claim blood links to Muhammad through Ali. There's one that doesn't actually go through Ali, and they vary. Some can be pacifists, some can be militants, some can be quietist, and as I mentioned, some can be governing. Not all Sufis belong to an order, but these orders have had a large effect. Okay, now I just wanted to talk to you, I just wanted to expose you quickly to some famous Sufis, so I've chosen just 4. And the first one's particularly interesting because she's a woman. Most of the Sufi literature is about men, but she's one of the earliest prominent voices, and it's Rabia of Basra. She lives in the 8th century, so this is just essentially about a century after Muhammad. And what she is perhaps particularly known for is really promoting this idea, perhaps even introducing the idea at some level of almost this emotional, again, I don't want to, like, there's almost something romantic in the imagery about the yearning for God. So for example, here's some of her poetry. Your hope in my heart is the rarest treasure. Your name on my tongue is the sweetest word. My choicest hours are the hours I spend with you. O Allah, I can't live in this world without remembering you. How can I endure the next world without seeing your face? I am a stranger in your country and lonely among your worshippers. This is the substance of my complaint. Right? Look at that language around treasure and sweetest, and my choicest hours are what I spend with you. It's like the kind of poetry you associate with a young couple in love, right? And so Rabia is sort of famous for this sort of thing, which will become quite common in the Sufi tradition. Second, I want to mention is Al-Hallaj. And he's famous. He tended to kind of cross certain boundaries. He was always seeking this union with God. And what he is most famous for, I should mention he's a little bit later than Rabia. What he's most famous for is uttering this phrase. He says, Ana al-Haq, which means, I am truth. And truth here is one of the 99 names of Allah. At some level, he is saying, I am God. And this doesn't go over well. He is put to death. It's sometimes said he was killed because he said this. There's some scholars who debate whether it was actually more kind of for political reasons. But the legend is that he's killed for this. And he will become a figure in Sufi tradition. And later Sufis will say, no, people just didn't understand that he'd been consumed by God. And so he becomes like a figure. But you know, he was misunderstood. The third figure is kind of the giant of the Sufi world. And this is Ibn Arabi. He lives a long life, but he dies sort of mid-13th century. He's in Andalusia in Spain, and sometimes considered the greatest sheikh, the greatest master of them all. He was not shy about his status because he once claimed to be the seal of the saints. And some of you will know that in Islam, Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. So he's not topping Muhammad, but there's an adoption of language. He caused controversy as well because of his monism. And I don't know if you know what monism is. Monotheism is a belief that there's one God. Monism is a belief that there's one God, but that everyone and everything is part of it. You will get this view in schools of Hindu thought, but here it's with Ibn Arabi as well. It's accused of it many times. And here's some of his poetry. And notice here how he's going to cross the boundaries of just regular kind of orthodox Islam, perhaps. My heart can take on any form, a meadow for gazelles, a cloister for monks, for the idols, sacred ground, Kaaba for the circling pilgrim, the tables of the Torah, the scrolls of the Quran. My creed is love. Wherever its caravan turns along the way, that is my belief, my faith. Right? So he's saying, I can be the field for the gazelle. He even references the idols. There's this crossing of boundaries that can happen. And the fourth, the guy you have to mention when you're talking about the Sufis, I think, is Rumi. Rumi, the great, I believe he's still the greatest selling poet in the Western world now, which is quite an accomplishment for this guy who died 700 years ago, the Persian writer. He was an accomplished person before he kind of has his big turnabout event. He was an accomplished jurist and teacher and familiar with the Sufi tradition. But when he's about 37 years old, he meets Shamsi Tabrizi, who completely transforms him into this person who is completely compelled by the Sufi tradition. And from thereafter, it is the Sufi path that will dominate his life. I'll give you some of his poetry. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of learning, it doesn't matter. Ours is not a caravan of despair. Come, even if you have broken your vow 1,000 times. Come yet again. Come, come. And another one, soul receives from soul that knowledge, therefore not by book, and nor from tongue. If knowledge of mysteries comes after emptiness of mind, that is illumination of heart. Right? You see what he's saying here. The ultimate knowledge is not from the book, it's not from the jurist, it's not from the scholar. Soul from soul. It's that intuitive. And one last one. This one's a bit longer. God has given us a dark wine so potent that drinking it, we leave the two worlds. God has put into the form of hashish a power to deliver the taster from self-consciousness. God has made sleep so that it erases every thought. God made Majnun love Layla so much that just her dog would cause confusion in him. There are thousands of wines that can take over our minds. Don't think all ecstasies are the same. Jesus was lost in his love for God. His donkey was drunk with barley. Drink from the presence of saints, not from those other jars. Every object, every being is a jar full of delight. Be a connoisseur and taste with caution. Any wine will get you high. Judge like a king and choose the purest, the ones unadulterated with fear or some urgency about what's needed. Drink the wine that moves you as a camel moves when it's been untied and is just ambling about. And so he is definitely the one whose poetry rings down to the present day.
Why is he talking about wine when it's forbidden?
The question is, why was he talking about wine when it's forbidden? Because it's a metaphor. Wine intoxicates you. Wine makes you lose yourself. And what the Sufi seeks is to be intoxicated with God, to lose some of their cares, to lose themselves in love, not for the drink, but for Allah. We've been dancing around this question of opposition. There has been opposition to Sufism all through its history. And I want to look at four key aspects of this opposition. The first one is this consistent with the Prophet? Is this consistent with Quran? And so there's a pro case and a con case. The pro case, that it is consistent, I mentioned to you a bit, that Muhammad is shown in the tradition as being frugal, as fasting, as sometimes engaging in prayer, extra prayer beyond what is required. That he is shown sometimes as discouraging laughter and gaiety and displaying contrition and sadness about the day of judgment. Right? That we shouldn't be lost in the temptations of this world, essentially. There is the night of power, the night that calls Muhammad to the prophetic task. What is he doing? Is he eating? Is he riding his horse? No. What is he doing? He's in a cave, meditating, right? This is a certain ascetic sort of path. And there is the night journey when he himself ascends to heaven, and this imagery of his ascent to heaven will become fundamental to the Sufi path. There is also, however, a con case. That is what the opposition sort of raises. And they will say, but Muhammad is not really an ascetic. He marries, he fathers, and he's a political leader. It's not the path of sort of the strong ascetic. They will say that the Quran really encourages Muslims to enjoy the physical gift God gives you. It says things like this in the Quran. Wear your beautiful apparel at every place of prayer. Eat and drink, but waste not by excess, for God loves not the wasters. There is this tradition in the Quran and in Islam that it teaches the middle path. Famously on the night journey, Muhammad, when he's in Jerusalem, is offered 3 goblets. Wine, milk, and water. And he does not drink the wine, and so Muslims do not drink wine, which represents here hedonism, but he does not drink the water, which is kind of the ascetic path. He drinks the milk, the middle path. And so some opponents have said, you've veered off the path. Some of Muhammad's closest companions had wealth, and there is a hadith where Muhammad says there is no monasticism in Islam. Now, as I mentioned to you, there's lots of hadith, and everyone argues about which ones are valid and not. And so from a Sufi perspective, they would argue that this one's not valid, but the opponents cite it. So that's one form of opposition. A second key point is that of interpretive authority. At times, some of these Sufi leaders can claim a kind of elite access to the Quran. So I mentioned to you Jafar al-Sadiq, who outlines 4 levels of meaning for 4 levels of listeners. This was a guy who, as a descendant of Muhammad, lives 100 years after him. He says there's a literal meaning for commoners, the allegorical meaning for the religious elite, the subtle for God's friends, which are the Sufi saints, and the real for the prophets. as you see. And so what he has done here, of course, is he has made the saints kind of above the religious elite, the clerics and the scholars, but of course below the prophets. And a second one is that by Ibn Arabi, and this becomes more common in the Sufi world, and it is just two layers. It is the exoteric, that is the outer meaning, which is available to everyone, and the esoteric or inner, that is just for the Sufis. And what will happen here is some of the critics will say, boy, you know, when you do this, even things like Sharia becomes just the outer meaning, and now you can undermine the Sharia. And so this causes great opposition. And the other thing is that sometimes these interpretations can threaten the very understanding of Quran itself. And for this, I want to use again Ibn Arabi and just the example of his interpretation of the golden calf. I don't know if you know this story. It's in Judaism and Christianity and Islam. It's a shared story. It's Moses goes up on Sinai and he receives the tablets. But while he's up there, the Jews, the Hebrews down at the base camp, create an idol, a golden calf, and they start worshiping the idol. And Moses comes down and he scolds them. And Ibn Arabi says, no, Moses misunderstood. He says, actually what's happening is that these people understand that God is in everything and everywhere. And of course he can be in a golden calf because he is manifested in everything. And he turns the idolaters in his interpretation from idolaters to Gnostics, to people who know the truth. And it is Moses who sort of doesn't see this. And you can see how, now that's not to say that all Sufis accept this interpretation by any means, but Ibn Arabi puts this forward, and you can see how some people would say, heavens, if you can do that, you are ripping the very authority out of the Quran entirely. This is dangerous stuff. And so that's the second one, the argument over interpretation. The third is simply the claim of heresy. The claim that the monism of Ibn Arabi is a kind of heresy. The intermediaries, some of you mentioned about the intermediaries, that putting someone between God, the worshiper, and God is wrong. And that there are also what are called sober and drunk Sufis. And some of the drunk Sufis, that is those more lost in the mystical excess, can cross boundaries. Some of them felt they were not bound by Sharia because that was just the outer meaning. There were certain ones that would do particularly outlandish things for many people. They would walk around naked. Some rejected property, rejected marriage, and sometimes engaged in extreme bodily mortification. So that was the third one. Oh yeah, and I do have a couple images. This bodily mortification, I want to be clear, most Sufis do not do this, but do you ever see, there are, on Good Friday, there are Catholics in Spain who get crucified and stuff like that. So this is like this drunk Sufi idea, some practicing extreme mortification. So you will see them with spears. I don't know if you can see this guy on the right, but it's going right through his cheek and sometimes lips. And there are others who do this other thing. I sort of hesitate whether to show you this image because I find it very difficult. But others engage in this very strange practice where they are able to put a knife behind their eyeball and prod it outward. Okay. Okay, I won't show it. So I'm going to click very fast. If you want to look it up, you can Google it. There are lots of images. I'm not a squeamish person, but I found them hard to look at. But there's something else. So you do get this, and so there's this claim of heresy. Yeah. Yes. Oh, yeah. There's lots of Sufis in India. Yes. Yep. I can't tell you for sure if they were in India or not. Yes.
So what's the rationale behind that?
It's to show. The question was, what is the rationale behind that? It is to show that one has been so overcome by God that you can overcome physical pain, that you have overcome your body itself. Right? Even nothing matters because you're intoxicated with God. And of course, many Sufis have nothing to do with that, but for some people, it's meaningful. And the last claim, quite simply, is the largest heresy, and that is that this is idolatry, that this worshiping at shrines turns these saints into godlike figures, and that this is horrible. This is the shirk, which is the greatest sin in Islam. The opposition is ancient. Characterized, for one example, in the figure of Ibn Taymiyyah, who is a spiritual godfather to some of the fundamentalisms of modern Islam. And more recently, not just these figures, but these are some prominent figures. Ibn Abdul Wahhab in the 18th century, who's the founder of the Wahhabi school, if you've heard of that school. He would destroy Sufi shrines in his day. And the currently, the Sufi path faces two challenges. On the one hand, from the very strong traditionalists or even fundamentalists who say this is heresy and are destroying their shrines in many places in the world. And on the other hand, from reformers and modernists who see some of these practices around the shrines as superstition. It's backwardness and magic, and we need to grow out of this. And so an attack sort of on both sides. And lastly, I just want to mention some modern developments. In places, the Sufi lodges continue with political involvement, in places like Chechnya and Africa. In some places, they've cooperated with colonial powers, and in some cases, been the voice that is opposed them the strongest. Dancing and singing have now become kind of a performance art, and so this causes greater tensions. You know, can you perform on stage? Is it still a spiritual practice? Or how do you keep it spiritual when you perform on stage? Women are now far more involved than they would have been historically. And now you have neo-Sufis. That is Sufis who are not Muslims. And so if you encounter a group today, this can be the first question, is it Muslim or not? Which is a question that would have made no sense 3 centuries or 5 centuries or 7 centuries ago. Okay, I'm sorry it took so long, and we'll take some more questions, but thank you very much. Okay, let's put some
back. Wasn't there a Sufi caliphate around the 12th century or so that where they were in control of a large area and population?
Not that I know of. Do you know of? I don't know of a Sufi caliphate.
Not for the whole thing, but I think they were in Egypt or something like that.
In Egypt, there was a Shia caliphate, the Fatimids, but I don't know of a Sufi caliphate. Good question. Anyone else?
From what I know as well, Sufism seems to have a unifying force. As it kind of acts as a unifying force to some extent, especially in the Indian subcontinent with some of the syncretic practices that you talked about. And just a comment, I don't think that Sufism is any less valid than quote-unquote more traditional forms, because those are also interpretive as well.
Yes.
Some of the more traditional ways to practice Islam. And I mean, I can also see a lot of positives from this kind of movement as well.
Yeah, and you're right. Particularly in India, it is a unifying force across traditions. And people who go to these shrines are not just Muslims; they are Sikhs, they are Hindus, they are Christians. So they do operate that way. Particularly, I think, in India. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk, Brian. That was absolutely amazing.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
I'm going to have a hard time following that one up. But I wanted to add, and it's something that you touched on, but I just wanted to elaborate on, is that one of the really defining characteristics of Sufism is its dedication to love of the divine.
Yes.
And that's the one thing that sort of helps distinguish it from other kinds of ascetic or Gnostic practices. And a lot of the Sufi masters in particular emphasize this love, and one was known to say that a mustard seed of love is worth more than 75 years of prayer. And you know, the Sufis that you touched on, like Rabia, for example, then elevated that to love of the divine being in exception to everything else. So loving God just for God and in a way that doesn't ask for anything back. So there's a tradition concerning Rabia where she was seen walking around Basra in the streets, holding a pitcher of water in one hand and a torch, so basically a flaming torch in the other. This is one of my favorite traditions. And everyone asked her, like, Rabia, what are you doing? And she said, I carry this pitcher of water so we can put out the flames of hell, and I carry this flaming torch so I can throw it into heaven and set it on fire. So we know who loves God for loving God as opposed to for what they can get from him.
That's great. Yeah, thanks. You know, thank you. Actually, I think I need to inject more of that. I last moment, I actually took, it's funny that you say that, I actually took out, as I was concerned about too many slides, a poem from Rabia right on that thing where she says, and I don't have the exact word for word quote, but it was basically, you know, oh God, if I love you to keep myself out of hell, send me to hell. And if I love you because I want access to paradise, deny me paradise. But if I love you for you alone, please do not hide yourself from me, or something like that. So it fits very, very well with it. I like the torch in the water, though. That's great.
Maybe one of the fundamental aspects is the monism part of the Sufism. And how do the practitioners of Dhikr with these multiple names, the 100 names of God, how do they reconcile their practice with the monist tradition of Sufism?
How do they
isn't there a contradiction? Because I think there was a debate around the issue of whether the God has these multiple attributes, or just God is one. One
Right.
is one, and then where?
Yes.
How does this practice of mentioning all attributes of God enter into Sufism? This is there a controversy?
Sure. And I could be misunderstanding you, but I think where the issue is, so the 99 names of God, to be clear, do not imply 99 gods. They're just characteristics, right? We can call God the truth, the loving, the just, the merciful, the avenger. He has all sorts of names. But God is one. These are just attributes of the one. And so the monism would not in any way violate that. God is just one now and everywhere, but he would still have those attributes. Does that make sense? They're like characteristics, but they don't insult the unity of Allah.
Well, I believe there is a different aspects in Sufism that monism that you described. Maybe Sufism might go, let's say, one step further, maybe to similar to a more pantheistic view. So this is not just one God, but this is everywhere that is the one.
Yeah.
So and then there is you cannot maybe directly debate this, but you can indirectly debate these within the Islamic tradition, let's say, among the names. So is there 100 names that we should mention, or there is only one? Because as you rightly mentioned about the names are very important. Right. But what do they signify? And then there might be other interpretations based on this. But I believe this when it is said, I am truth, but truth is the only the truth, one. This is how I interpret and how I understand this.
Right.
So, I wonder if there is other Sufi traditions maybe that is 100% opposed of these kind of zikrs, for instance.
Opposed to the 99 names?
Opposed of mentioning names, mentioning not just one name, because, for instance, the dance, it's also a little bit some sort of so not revolving around Mecca, but revolving around the heart. So right. It also implies some sort of oneness in quite a radical way.
Yeah.
If you interpret it from a certain angle.
Yeah.
But this doesn't. But the other one is mentioning these 100 names. Would it be some different opinions within Sufism? This is what
I don't know of an alignment between the acceptance of the 99 names and it affecting the monism. Like I think they see those as different things, just characteristics of the one. We'll go to another question. Just before we do, I forgot to pass this around. If any of you want to be on my email list, I email 10 or 12 times a year. I'll pass this around. You don't have to sign it. All I ask for is your first name in your email. I really don't need your last name. It's none of my business. But if you want to, you can sign up. And when I'm doing things in Toronto, you'll get an email from me. Oh, great. Look at that. Leandro does all things. Okay, Erjan?
difference between monism, pantheism, and panentheism?
So the difference is monism, pantheism, and panentheism. So monism and pantheism are really, I think, essentially the same thing. There's one living, breathing reality, and it's, should I say that? So the gradations become, there's one God, and he's in everything. But does that God transcend the physical universe or not? Right? You can just have a physical universe that is pervaded by spirit, but there's nothing outside the physical universe. This is kind of it, versus everything's part of the one, but the one is not contained, but transcends the physical universe. Does that make sense?
Which one is which?
Sorry, what's that?
Which one is which?
I'm trying to remember. Panentheism is, I believe, that the one God transcends the physical universe. And most monism is like that as well. But pantheism is just a living, breathing universe that is spiritual. Often pantheism does not distinguish, does not have the dualism of matter and spirit. In pantheism, often there is no dualism. Spirit is, matter is spiritual. So that it doesn't transcend the physical, because the physical is spiritual. Does that make sense? All Western traditions have dualism, but some of them don't. The pantheism doesn't. Okay, next question.
Well, the way I understood it is that Ibn Arabi was not really a pantheist. It's true that he's the one who articulated unity of being, wahdat al-wujud, but he made a distinct difference between the essence of God being the hidden, the transcendent and attainable, and the manifested. And there's a hadith al-Qudsi that says, I was a hidden treasure and I long to be known, so I have created. But he does make that distinction in his writings. So in my view, he was not a pantheist.
Thanks, that's good. And he was accused of it sometimes by opponents, yes. Yeah, thanks. Up front here.
Well, so this is not my tradition, but from what I've read about Sufism, and also reading, stories of Sufi masters, and I was struck even before I read further on, possible historical influences, how similar some of these stories seem to the tellings of Buddhist masters. Oh. And subsequently, I did read that there is considerable opinion out there that there was Buddhist influence on the development of Sufism. And of course, one would look to the older tradition as being the influence on the younger tradition. I guess partly because of, the geographical proximity to India, but as well because of the beliefs and practices, the beliefs like the monistic belief, the idea that the goal of religious seeking is a oneness, an dual oneness. The practices like sitting, to attain a beatitude or even ecstasy, the celibacy, the following the master or guru devotionally, the going outside of words and the intellect, the rational for a direct intuitive grasp of the metaphysical. I suppose also the iconoclastic kind of aspect of it, which is that one, will, seek for oneself, the direct truth, the, direct intuitive truth attained at the personal level, and most importantly of all, the emptying or the overcoming of ego, which is the number one goal of Buddhism.
Yeah.
And so that's, what I've come across, that there is considerable opinion out there, scholarly opinion out there, that there was an influence from India and most specifically from Buddhism. And so I'm wondering if you have anything to say about that.
That's interesting. There is definitely certain parallels amongst different mystical paths, and some people have spent a lot of time drawing some of those connections. I haven't heard so much about the borrowing from Buddhism. I have heard, as I mentioned, sort of the relevance of the Christian monastics that were prevalent, and some from Judaism. And similarly, some borrowing, of course, that went the other way. Jewish Kabbalah will take off in Spain, really, in the 13th century, and looks in many ways to adapt practices and things from Sufism that really were not part of Torah. So I think in all cases there's some sharing and borrowing going on. I hadn't heard about that specific one, but I'd heard of some of the other ones. Both
all the sources I've looked at, and not that I look extensively,
Sure.
but scholarly sources, significant scholarly sources have mentioned that as one and dominant
influence.
yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the problem, I guess, that any the mystical branch of any religion has, and that is that at the heart of it is the individual search for God, which is anarchic and tends to be personal, individual, go off in all different directions. But if it's going to survive, it has to become institutionalized.
Yeah.
And if it
that's
becomes
right.
institutionalized, it tends to become sclerotic and unmystical.
Yeah.
And this is a problem to which I think there is no solution.
Yeah, you're very right. This is an ancient tension in religious traditions, is the moment of effervescence, the charisma, the intuitive experience, the mysticism that transforms my life. And then for the thing to continue, you're right, you need the building up of structures and institutions. And a lot of people say, well, now you've robbed it of what was good. And then eventually there's a kind of reform movement. I would say in this dynamic, it's always painted as good and bad. You need the mysticism and the ecstasy, but those stupid institutions and structures. But I always think the institutions and structures get a bad name. Because without the institutions and structures, you would not pass on the tradition that enables someone else to reinvigorate, to reform. You need those structures. You need those institutions that print the texts and write them out and copy manuscripts and fund the school systems, the madrasas or the whatever it is, the yeshivas. Yeah, that tension's always there. But I always think the institution building folks get slammed on. Any other questions?
Much like the Revolutionary Party in Mexico, they were in power for 70 years.
Yeah.
And
not
how can you be revolutionary if you've been in power for 70 years?
Thank you very much. Okay, folks, I'm sorry that I went longer than normal, so I apologize about that. Thanks very much for your questions and your comments. And and if any of you are interested in coming to the summer program, I'd love to see you there. It's just so much fun. So thanks very much.
Oh yeah, I know it.